Okay, so step number 4. How does your character change by the end of the scene? Okay, this is important. I feel that characters need to change in some way in every single scene. And I even wrote a blog post last year called "Every Scene Should Contain a Death." This was based on my friend James Scott Bell's belief or teaching that every novel should have a death in it. I take that one step further and say every scene should have a death in it. Of course, if you're writing a murder mystery, you might actually have a literal death in 1 or 2 of your scenes. But that's obviously not what we're talking about for most novels and most scenes. So what do I mean? A death could be applied to anything, okay? A death of a dream, an idea, a concept, an opinion, an understanding, a friendship, a job, a relationship of some sort. So let's take my example with Arnold the fisherman. What happens? How does he change by the end of the scene? Well, he starts off very depressed and even suicidal, right? He's very depressed. It's the anniversary of his son's death. He gets to the bay and gets this baby out of the trunk. Now, how has he changed? All of a sudden, his demeanor has changed. His outlook has changed. What has died? His hopelessness has died. His feeling of that God has completely abandoned him has died. All of a sudden, he feels a shift in his destiny. He might even feel a little twinge of hope, maybe some trepidation. But you can see how the character has changed by the end of the scene. He's not the same as he was 20 minutes earlier when he stepped out of his little cottage, his shack on the beach, feeling very depressed because of what he had done, right? So think about how your character might change by the end. And again, it can be really subtle. Oftentimes it's just a change in perspective. Because when the plot is advanced and the character learns something new, that should change him, change his approach, change the way he views something. If you have a detective story and he thought somebody was guilty and then he finds a new clue and realizes that this person isn't guilty, what's changed is his view of that person. All of a sudden he realizes that someone else is out there that's guilty of this crime, right? If you're doing a love story, a romantic story, maybe the character has this idealized view of this man that she is hoping to marry, and then she sees him behave in a certain way, and all of a sudden her attitude toward him changes. He does something that is something that she didn't expect that really shines a bad light on him. Conversely, it could be something different. It could be a guy that she really didn't like very much, but then she sees him do something really wonderful for somebody. And all of a sudden, her perspective of that man changes. So I hope you'll keep that in mind too. So those are the 4 key elements to working on a scene. And the other 4 are a little more specific and smaller. For instance, number 5 is determine the point of view. Now, that's pretty easy if you're writing a first-person novel. You already know what point of view you're in. But if you're doing shifting third-person point of view, or maybe a combination of first and third, oftentimes I read novels where the protagonist is in first person and all the other characters are in third person. I see this in James Lee Burke's novels, for example. So you might have a choice between a number of characters of whose point of view it should be. So how do you determine whose point of view it is? Well, you want to figure out who is the best person to show what's happening, whose insight is most important. You might have a scene with your protagonist and his sidekick, and maybe his sidekick is a point of view character as well in some of the scenes. But maybe you want the sidekick to see something or notice something or process something that happens in a way that only he can, that's important to the story. It's important to reveal to your reader. So you'll choose to put that scene in the sidekick's point of view, okay? So there's a lot more to determining point of view, but that's the basic sum of it. Number 6, I think I mentioned this. Leave the boring stuff out. Keep what's interesting, take out what's boring. So now as you're writing your scene, or maybe you've already written a rough draft, let it gush, write it as wordy as you want, come back in and take out the boring stuff. Again, if you start a scene knowing where your high moment is, what's important, what the purpose of your scene is, that this is going to be an important scene, serves a purpose, you know your high moment, you go back 20 minutes, start the scene in the middle of action, you build and build and build with obstacles or twists or complications or inner and outer conflict. You're not going to have too much boring stuff, right? First of all, you don't have time to put in too much boring stuff. If you have your character spend 15 minutes looking at the flowers, that's boring and you haven't built to this high moment, right? So I hope that this helps you understand that this is a great way to write dynamic scenes. This is also going to keep you from putting in too much backstory, because if you dump a lot of backstory in, you're just stopping the action that's happening in the present and you're putting in a lot of extra information. So if you have to put in some backstory, keep it to 2 or 3 lines at most. Make it pertinent. Don't just put backstory in to explain something. You're in your character's point of view. It needs to be through her eyes. She's the one that's going to be thinking of that backstory. So what's going to trigger it? If my character Arnold walks over to that memorial that he made for his son, obviously he's going to think about his son. He's going to think about that terrible day where he went out to sea drunk with his son and his son fell overboard and he was too drunk to save him. He's going to think about how his wife left and how his whole life fell apart because of what he did that day. And he's going to think of all those things because it's the anniversary of his son's death, and going to that memorial stone triggers those thoughts, those bits of backstory. So always have a trigger for the backstory. Don't ever just start explaining something about how your character went to high school in, Indiana, and he was top of his class, and then he went on to college and decided to become, a quarterback. If that has nothing to do with the moment, if the character is not like suddenly coming across his award from when he was in college, or what his valedictorian speech notes from when he was in high school, what's the point of bringing that out? And it doesn't fit the moment. It doesn't feel organic. And if any of that is not important to the story, don't have any of it in there, okay? Leave the boring stuff out. Leave the unimportant stuff out. Okay, step 7, work on your beginning and ending hooks. Spend some time making the opening of your scene engaging. Yes, we know our novel has to have a hook at the very opening. The very first line of our novel has to have a hook. But every scene, I feel, should have some sort of a hook. It may not be dramatic. It might just be an opening line that helps you get right into the next scene. But I feel that the more you spend on making a really interesting opening to every scene, the better. And also, of course, you want to have that ending hook to be killer. It should be great. I don't care what genre you're writing in. You want to really make those last lines of the scene just punch home your character's feeling, your character's mood, how your character has changed, what new revelation they've come to, what new twist has happened. It may be that your scene is going to end with action. That's fine. Your character could be walking down a street and there's a big explosion and all of a sudden your character's thrown against a building and knocked out. End of scene. That's fine too. That's a cliffhanger. That's dynamic. And your purpose or your high moment of the scene is to show the explosion. That's good. Okay. Number 8. This is where you add in texture and sensory details. I mentioned the sensory details earlier, but you might need to go back through and put those in. Try to find spots on every single page where you add in some sensory detail. And again, it doesn't have to just be sight. It could be smell, hearing. It could be physical sensations. It could be the way that they feel inside. Maybe their stomach is hurting. I mean, there's all kinds of sensations that we have as human beings. So take a look at that handout on the 21 senses and pick a few. See if you can work those into your story. Be sure the first paragraphs of your scene establish the setting. Think about weather, time of day, time of year, seasons. I can't tell you how many times I read about characters that go outside and there's no reaction to the weather. Honestly, when I go outside, that's the very first thing I notice. Is that what you do? I mean, when you go outside, if it's really hot out, boom, you get hit with this heat and you've been in an air-conditioned room, you're going to notice that. You're not going to notice it 10 minutes later, like, oh my gosh, it's really hot and I'm sweating, right? You're also going to notice if it's early in the morning, or if there's a chill in the air, or if the air feels wet or damp from the fog, right? So there's a texture feeling there. So also the time of year is really important, because sometimes I'll read a book for 50 pages, 100 pages. I have no idea where this novel is set. And then the author might say that it's in the deep south. And I'm like, really? And I didn't even know what time of year it was. Is it summer where it's really muggy and hot? Or is it the winter and it's just damp and cold? I mean, are her clothes sticking to the back of her neck? I mean, I feel like this is so important because we're so aware of the weather. And while experts will tell you, or instructors will tell you, never start your novel with the weather. Granted, you don't want to just say it was a dark and stormy night, but again, you want to have a believable scene. So what's believable? What's believable is if your character is somewhere, she's going to be feeling something about the weather and the time of year. She might be locked in a cubicle down in a basement office, maybe not in that scene, but when she gets outside, she's going to notice what time of year it is. If the fall leaves are blowing and that crisp wind is biting her neck, we get a sensation of the fall. We get a feeling for that weather, that time of year, and that's really important. So also think about the time of day and how much time is passing. It's really important if you're moving from scene to scene to imply how much time has passed for your character, because if last we saw it was nighttime and she was doing something in the middle of the night, and now you show her, manicuring her toenails or something. That's not a manicure. Sorry, pedicure, getting a pedicure. You're still thinking it's the middle of the night. It seems kind of odd that she would be getting a pedicure. So you've got to establish the time of day for the most part. Basically, you want to just include these details that are going to transport your reader into your story, and that's by using sensory details. So choose intriguing settings that will add texture to your scene where possible. Try to avoid defaulting to coffee shops and restaurants. I can't tell you how many boring restaurants and coffee shop scenes I have read. I mean, I just want to gag myself with a Starbucks cup. I'm sorry. I had one beginning novelist, send his manuscript to me for a critique. He was a very famous attorney in San Francisco, but I found it just incredibly tedious to the point of absolute hysteria and hilarity that I counted 21 restaurant scenes in his novel. I let him know that. I would say if you really, really have to have a scene in a restaurant or a coffee shop because that's ordinary life, or it used to be before the coronavirus, I would keep it to one per novel, and I would make sure that something very important happens in that coffee shop or that restaurant, to the point where you probably couldn't have that scene set in any other place. Okay? That's going to be a challenge for you, because anything that you have happen in a coffee shop, I could bet you could probably put in a much more interesting setting. You need somebody to spill coffee on somebody, do it on the jogging path along the Thames River, in front of Kew Gardens or something. I don't know. I mean, show the setting, bring it to life so that readers can see the place that your character's in. Okay, so those are the 8 steps to a perfect scene. I hope you'll take a look at the document. I hope you'll print out the PDF, make copies of it, and when you're about to sit down and write a scene, go through it. There's spaces for you to write things down. So do the brainstorming work first before you get writing your scene. Why? Because you're going to waste hours of time writing a boring scene that has too much boring stuff in it, that doesn't serve a purpose, that isn't written in your point of view character's voice or style. It doesn't reflect your character's mood or motivation or mindset in that moment. And it's not going to accomplish really anything that's going to be purposeful for your novel. So I hope that this has been interesting for you. I also want to take a look briefly at my scene structure checklist, which is going to also cover some of the things that I've just discussed. But let me read this definition that I have here from Jordan Rosenfeld's book, Make a Scene. Okay. She says, scenes are capsules in which compelling characters undertake significant actions in a vivid and memorable way that allows the events to feel as though they are happening in real time. And this is going back to what I said about cinematic technique. Okay. Everything has to feel as if you're watching it on a movie screen. So if you're watching a movie scene, for example, and there's all kinds of interesting action and characters are doing things and they're talking and stuff's happening, and all of a sudden the screen goes blank and you hear some voice, which you learn is the author who wrote the screenplay, the scriptwriter. And all of a sudden, the script writer starts talking and saying, okay, I want you to know about these different characters. John grew up in Brooklyn and he had a very poor family, and so he didn't have much to eat growing up. But as he got older, he decided he was going to become the best stockbroker in the world. So he studied hard and blah, 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 blah. And you're just thinking, why is the screen blank? I was watching these characters in all this really interesting action, and all of a sudden, I'm just hearing this person tell me all about these characters. I don't want to hear about the characters. I don't want to be told. I just want to watch what's happening. So I hope I'm making my point here to you about showing, not telling. writing in a cinematic way so the reader can watch your characters moment by moment happening in real time. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So capsule. The word capsule implies a limited, compressed period of time. Scenes start in one moment in the present action, and they move forward in time, and then they end. That's what I've been discussing this whole time. If you need a character to flash back on something, just have a quick little couple lines of flashback to have them triggered something that they need to think about in that moment that's important to your scene and important to your story. All of a sudden, they remember where that baseball came from and why that baseball is important to solving this clue, whatever. Okay. Of course, if you're writing a time travel story, your character might travel back and forth in time and flip around like the time traveler's wife. Fine. That's because that fits your premise and genre. But for most novels, you want to have a scene that starts in one moment and moves forward and doesn't skip around in time. Okay, she also mentioned the compelling characters that undertake significant actions. Okay, we want compelling characters. They have to have significant action. If they're the protagonist, what the protagonist is doing needs to advance that plot. If it's another character or other characters, they need to have significant impact on the protagonist and on him going after his goal. Okay, all characters can play different roles in a story. If you take a look at my brand new online course that I just put up on my online school, Teachable, it's called Your Cast of Characters. You'll learn that there's all different types of roles that characters can play, and they can play more than one role. But it's important to think about, when you're writing a scene, what characters do you need in that scene? What roles are they going to play? And how are they going to serve the purpose of your plot? How are they going to impact your protagonist? Because everything has to impact your protagonist, either directly or indirectly, because novels, films, stories, all are about one character basically going after a short-term goal. The exception to this, of course, are family sagas or biographies. A movie like Gandhi isn't going to just be about a short-term goal. Okay. She mentions actions that occur that are vivid and memorable. Again, this speaks to sensory detail, bringing scenes to life without bogging down with too much unnecessary description. Okay. And then happening in real time. And that's what I already touched on. Backstory, long flashbacks, excessive narration, stop the present action and interrupt the pacing. You want to keep good pacing in your scenes. Okay. So my checklist has a checklist, and I'll pull that up on the screen so you can see it. Obviously, there's lots of items on the checklist, and I'm not going to go over them all right now, but you can go over them. And I would encourage you to first read through all these different items. Your scene isn't going to tick all of them off because some scenes aren't going to need all these things, but you do want to consider all these different items on the checklist and see if they can be useful for your scene. For instance, let me read a few of them. My scene has a strong opening line or a hook that grabs the reader. We talked about that. My scene's important to the plot. I guess we've talked about that too. My scene helps reveal something new about the character or the plot. Again, that's about advancing the plot. My scene gives a brief nod to setting through the character's point of view. We talked about that. My scene stays in one point of view the whole time. Very important. Then we talk about dialogue and bits of narrative, making clear how much time has passed. Maybe elements of surprise or twists. My scene starts in a different way than the last scene started. Something to think about. And then what about getting rid of clunky words and clunky writing, tightening up, being concise with your writing. Think about your camera angles. Does my camera move around and show specific details where I want the reader to pay attention? Microtension. Do I create mystery? Microtension has a lot to do with keeping the reader on edge or wanting to know more. And I have a session. Microtension is a whole other topic, and I have blog posts on that, and I actually have a module in my emotional mastery course on microtension. If you don't know what that is, I think it would be good for you to do some research on that, because you need microtension on every single page, honestly, believe me. So I hope that this session on scene structure is helpful. We kind of jumped around and looked at a lot of different things. I wanted to give you a brief overview of just all the basics. So just to review, scenes are best when they're capsules of time. They're best when they're done in a short period of 15 to 20 minutes for your character. They work best if you first know and identify what the purpose of your scene is and make sure that purpose is tied in with the premise and the plot for your story, so that it's not just, oh, my scene is just so you can kind of get to know some new characters. No, we don't want that. Those new characters better serve a purpose or out they go. And we also want to think about that high moment at the end. You want to build to that high moment and work backwards. I always work backwards. Start with your high moment. How is your scene going to end? What is the point of that scene? And then go back 20 minutes, figure out where your character can be, how you can set up his mood, his mindset, his motivation, so that that high moment will be punched home, okay? If you want to read a terrifically great opening scene, I use it a lot in my scene mastery boot camps. I would suggest that you read the opening scene to Candace Fox's first book in her series, Crimson Lake. Okay, Candace Fox. And she is a master writer. I just finished reading her third book in the series. I couldn't put it down. It was fantastic. Her characters jump off the page. Amazing. But the opening scene to Candace Fox's Crimson Lake is brilliant. Even though it's a detective book, it's a story about a detective who teams up with another detective to solve a missing persons case. The first scene is all about this guy living in a ramshackled rented house in the swamps of Australia, and he rescues a goose and takes it to the vet. Why is it such a fantastic scene? I'm not going to tell you. I'm going to have you read it and you figure it out, okay? If you know that the purpose of the first scene in your novel is to set up your character, you will see why this scene is brilliant. It has nothing to do with the plot, nothing to do with the premise of the missing persons case, but it sets up the tone, the motivation, the mindset, and the mood perfectly. So I hope that this has been informative to you, and I hope you will dig into these charts and PDFs. My blog, Live, Write, Thrive, has more than 1 million words of instruction for writers. And of course, I have 10 or so books in my Writer's Toolbox series. So take a look at my books and check out the online courses at cslakin.teachable.com. I think you will find a plethora of instruction that you can feed on for months, if not years. And I hope that this is going to help you write great scenes, because scenes are the heart of a novel. And if your scenes are great, that's going to be your big first step to writing a great book. Thanks for taking the time to watch this, and I hope you've learned a lot.